My name is Anna Hawthorne, and I am 34 years old. For most of my life, that name, Hawthorne, felt like a borrowed coat, something heavy and ornate that never quite fit my shoulders. It belongs to the Hawthornes of London, a name etched onto the brass plaques of shipping offices and spoken with reverence in the wood-paneled rooms of maritime insurers. It smells of sea salt and diesel, but also of old money and older secrets. I, on the other hand, have always smelled of damp earth, of ozone before a storm, of the sweet decay of autumn leaves. My family built an empire on predicting the movement of goods across the globe. I learned to predict the movement of clouds across the sky. They never imagined that one day their vast, teetering fortune would depend entirely on the quaint provincial obsession of a country mouse. They never thought the only thing that could save them from the coming storm was the one person who knew what a real storm felt like. Before I dive into the story of how my family's dismissive laughter turned into desperate silence, I want to connect with all of you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. It's incredible to see how a single story can reach every corner of the world, and if you've ever felt underestimated, like your unique skills were seen as a hobby instead of a strength, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps to know you're not alone. And for anyone new here, please subscribe to join a community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest voice in the room is the one worth listening to. It all began with the rain, or rather, the lack of it. My move to London wasn't a choice so much as an inevitability, a piece of driftwood washed ashore by the tide of grief. My parents, both taken by a sudden illness within a month of each other, had been the anchors of my world on our Norfolk farm. They had lived and breathed that land, just as their parents had before them. The farm wasn't just a place, it was a living chronicle of our family, a history told in soil composition and hedgerow growth. My grandfather, a man whose hands were as cracked and patterned as a drought-stricken field, was the one who first taught me to read the sky. He didn't just teach me to look for storm clouds, he taught me to feel the shift in atmospheric pressure in my joints, to smell the ionization in the air that preceded a lightning strike, to understand that the behavior of the rooks in the high elms was as reliable a barometer as any device hanging on a wall. Nature writes its intentions everywhere, Anna, he used to say, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. You just have to learn the language. While other children were learning their multiplication tables, I was learning the intricate dance between the jet stream and the North Atlantic Oscillation. It wasn't science, not at first. It was lore, an instinct passed down through generations who depended on it for their very survival. Leaving that world for London was like being plunged into a sensory deprivation tank. The city air was a dead thing, thick with fumes and noise, telling me nothing but stories of human hurry. My Uncle Thomas, my father's estranged older brother, had taken me in. It was a gesture, born of familial duty, not affection. He and my father had been two sides of a coin, one chasing fortune on the tides of global commerce, the other finding his wealth in the turning of the seasons. Their separation had been a quiet, gradual drifting apart, a silent acknowledgement that they no longer spoke the same language. Uncle Thomas's home in Kensington was a monument to his success. It was a tall, imposing townhouse of pale stone, where the silence was deep and polished, broken only by the chiming of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting out the seconds of my discomfort. My Aunt Marian was a woman who seemed to be sculpted from porcelain and anxieties. Her life revolved around maintaining the perfect gloss of their social standing. She greeted me with a kiss that barely brushed my cheek, her eyes doing a swift, merciless inventory of my plain, country-made dress. My cousin Beatrice, their only child, was London personified, sharp, stylish, and utterly certain of her own brilliance. She was a few years older than me, already a rising star in the family company, Hawthorne Maritime. She looked me up and down with an expression that was halfway between pity and amusement. "So you're the rustic cousin," she'd said, not as a question, but as a verdict. "Welcome to civilization." The first few weeks were a blur of awkward adjustments. I was a ghost at their breakfast table, a silent observer, of a life conducted at a pace and volume I couldn't comprehend. The first real exhibition of their casual cruelty came during a dinner party. The house was filled with the kind of people I'd only ever seen in magazines. Men in sharp suits, who talked about derivatives and tonnage, and women with diamonds at their throats, who discussed art auctions and summering in the south of France. I sat beside a portly man who, upon learning I was from Norfolk, asked if I had personally known the famous turkeys from the region. I tried to explain the complexities of modern agriculture, the science of crop rotation, the challenges of soil degradation, but his eyes glazed over. It was Beatrice who delivered the killing blow. She caught the tail end of my attempt at conversation and laughed, a sound like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. "Oh, don't get Anna started on her dirt reports," she announced to the table, her voice carrying across the polished mahogany. "She's absolutely obsessed, spends her days tracking weather patterns. You'd think she was planning an invasion, not trying to decide when to plant potatoes." A ripple of polite, condescending laughter went around the table. My cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the stuffy dining room. "It's more complicated than that," I mumbled, my voice feeling small and thin. "Global weather systems are interconnected. What happens with sea temperatures in the Pacific can affect rainfall in Europe months later. It's fascinating." Beatrice arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Fascinating, darling? Perhaps if you're a farmer. But here in the real world, we deal in tangible assets. We move millions of tons of steel and grain based on contracts and market analysis, not on whether a cow is lying down in a field." She turned to the man next to her, a banker with a predatory smile. "She's a country mouse, through and through, utterly charming, but a bit provincial." The word hung in the air. Provincial. It was a brand, a judgment. It designated me as small, irrelevant, a quaint relic from a world that didn't matter. I felt every eye on me, not with malice, but with a kind of gentle, dismissive curiosity, as if I were an interesting specimen under glass. I spent the rest of the dinner in silence, pushing a piece of sea bass around my plate, the humiliation a cold, heavy knot in my stomach. The conversation flowed around me, a river of talk about container shipping rates, port congestion in Singapore, and the rising price of bunker fuel. They were talking about the world, a big, important world that I was apparently too small to understand. But all I could think was that they were only looking at the surface of the water, completely oblivious to the deep, powerful currents moving beneath. That night, I retreated to my guest room, a beautifully appointed cage, and spread out my charts on the floor. I had my laptop, a subscription to several meteorological data services, and the old leather-bound almanacs I'd brought with me from the farm. They were my only connection to the person I used to be. As I traced the lines of an emerging sea temperature anomaly off the coast of Peru, I felt a familiar calm settle over me. This was a language I understood. Here, in this world of data and patterns, I wasn't provincial, I was home. To keep me busy, as my uncle put it, I was given a menial job at the Hawthorne Maritime Head Office, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the City of London. My official title was Archival Assistant, which was a grand name for being given a dusty basement office and told to digitize decades of old shipping manifests and logbooks. It was mind-numbingly dull work, but it was also a blessing. It gave me a backdoor education in the company's operations. I learned their primary routes, their biggest clients, the commodities they relied on: grain from North America, iron ore from Australia, rice from Southeast Asia. I saw the arteries of their empire laid bare in faded ink on brittle paper. My little basement office became my sanctuary and my secret laboratory. While the clatter of the office life hummed floors above me, I had two screens on my desk. One displayed the monotonous scans of old documents. The other was my portal to the world's weather. I started a new project, a private obsession. I began to cross-reference the company's historical shipping data with meteorological records from the same periods. I wanted to see if the patterns my grandfather had taught me to spot on a local scale held true on a global one, and they did. I saw a dip in Australian wheat shipments in 1998 that correlated perfectly with a severe El Niño event. I saw port closures in the Bay of Bengal that coincided with years of abnormally strong cyclone activity. The company, it seemed, had always treated these events as isolated, unpredictable acts of God. They reacted to disasters. They never anticipated them. Their entire business model was based on the assumption that the world of yesterday would be the world of tomorrow. From my lowly vantage point, I also became an accidental repository of corporate gossip. The logistics coordinators and junior traders would come down to the archives to fetch old files, complaining about their bosses and the day's frustrations. I would listen silently as I scanned, piecing together a picture of the company's present. I heard whispers of minor delays. A few grain shipments out of the Gulf of Mexico were behind schedule because of a prolonged dry spell affecting water levels on the Mississippi. A typhoon in the South China Sea, stronger than expected for the season, had forced a dozen of their container ships to reroute, costing a fortune in fuel. Beatrice, when I saw her in the communal kitchen, dismissed it all with a wave of her hand. Logistical headaches, she'd call it. The cost of doing business. But I could see a fine web of worry beginning to form around her eyes. She was seeing scattered problems. I was seeing the first threads of a single, global tapestry of disruption. The pattern was becoming clearer to me every day. The Pacific sea surface temperatures were climbing steadily, a classic signature of a developing El Niño. But this one felt different. The warming was faster, the area larger, than anything I'd seen in the historical data. This wasn't just a weather event, it was a climate anomaly. I knew what it meant. It meant severe drought in Australia and parts of Asia. It meant torrential, destructive rains in South America. And most critically for Hawthorne Maritime, it meant a weakened, erratic North American harvest. They had contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars to ship grain that I was becoming convinced would soon not exist. I had to say something. I spent a week compiling my data into a concise 2-page report, complete with charts and projections. I made it as businesslike as possible, using terms like risk mitigation and supply chain vulnerability. I avoided any mention of folklore or farmer's wisdom. This was pure data. I waited for an evening, when I knew my Uncle Thomas would be in his study alone. A rare moment of quiet in his hectic schedule. I knocked on the heavy oak door, my heart pounding against my ribs. He looked up from his desk, surprised to see me. "Anna, what is it?" I handed him the report, my hands trembling slightly. "Uncle Thomas, I know this isn't my place, but I've been looking at some things, some data. I'm worried about the grain contracts in North America. The long-range weather models are alarming." He took the papers, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance at the interruption. He glanced at the first page, his eyes skimming the charts. I saw the moment his mind classified it. This was my hobby, my strange little obsession. This was not a serious business document. He folded the papers neatly and placed them on the corner of his desk, a gesture of polite dismissal. "Anna, I appreciate your diligence," he said. The word a careful, diplomatic choice. "But we have a whole department of market analysts, the best in the business, who handle this. They look at futures, at government reports, at economic indicators. It's a very complex field. But they're not looking at the atmospheric drivers," I insisted, my voice more urgent than I intended. "They're looking at the consequences, not the cause. By the time it shows up in their reports, it will be too late." He gave me a tired, paternal smile and patted my hand. It was a gesture, meant to soothe a hysterical child. "You have a good heart, my dear, and a bright mind. But leave the global strategy to us. We've been navigating these waters for 100 years. He then looked past me, towards the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a call with our partners in Hamburg. Why don't you go and see if your aunt needs help with the arrangements for the charity garden party? That's a much better use of your talents." Defeated, I turned to leave. As I closed the door behind me, I saw Beatrice standing in the hallway. She had clearly been listening. She held a file in her hand, but her posture was one of triumphant stillness. A slow, smug smirk spread across her face. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her expression said it all. The country mouse had tried to play with the city cats, and had been put firmly back in her place. I walked back down the grand staircase, the weight of their condescension pressing down on me. The unread report on my uncle's desk, feeling like a prophecy no one was willing to hear. The change, when it came, wasn't a gradual slide, but a sickening lurch, like a great ship hitting an uncharted reef. The whispers in the basement archives turned into anxious murmurs in the hallways, then into grim, tight-lipped meetings behind the closed doors of the boardroom. The news reports started as background noise, stories from faraway places. A drought in the American Midwest, initially described as serious, was upgraded to catastrophic. Satellite images on the evening news showed vast, cracked earth landscapes where fields of corn and wheat should have been shimmering. The Mississippi River was so low that barges were running aground. The grain Hawthorne Maritime was contracted to ship from the port of New Orleans, was trapped hundreds of miles upstream, and even what was getting through was a fraction of the expected volume. Simultaneously, the other side of my prediction crashed into reality. A series of monsoons, powered by the superheated waters of the Pacific, slammed into Southeast Asia. They weren't just storms, they were meteorological bombs. Ports in Vietnam, Thailand, and the Philippines were closed. Coastal infrastructure was washed away. The rice harvests, another cornerstone of Hawthorne's commodity trade, were drowned in their paddies. Suddenly, the logistical headaches Beatrice had spoken of were a full-blown corporate migraine. Every television in the office was tuned to financial news channels, where grim-faced analysts spoke of unprecedented supply chain disruption and extreme market volatility. Hawthorne Maritime's stock price, once a proud, stable pillar on the London Stock Exchange, began to bleed value, dropping point after agonizing point each day. The polished calm of the office evaporated, replaced by a thrumming, barely concealed panic. My Uncle Thomas seemed to age a decade in a matter of weeks. His face was perpetually gray with exhaustion. His shoulders stooped under an invisible weight. Beatrice was a whirlwind of frantic activity, barking orders into her phone, her voice strained and brittle. She was trying to solve 1,000 individual problems, rerouting ships, placating furious clients, renegotiating contracts, but she was patching leaks on a ship that was already sinking. She saw 100 separate, unforeseeable disasters. She still couldn't, or wouldn't, see the single, immense engine driving them all. I tried to talk to my Aunt Marion one evening, hoping to find a different path to my uncle. I found her in the drawing room, agonizing over seating charts for an upcoming gala. "Aunt Marion," I began gently, "I know everyone is under a lot of stress, but I really think the company is misdiagnosing the problem. This isn't just a run of bad luck." She looked up at me, her face a mask of polite incomprehension. "Anna, dear, whatever are you talking about? It's all terribly stressful, of course. Thomas is working himself to the bone. The last thing he needs is more worry." She gestured to her charts. "Now, do you think Mr. Henderson should be seated next to Lady Carmichael? He does so love to talk about his yachts, and she finds it dreadfully dull." "This is more important than seating charts," I pressed, feeling my frustration rise. "The company could be in real danger. I have data that shows this is likely to get worse, not better, for at least another 6 months." She finally put down her pen and gave me her full attention. But her eyes were filled with a placid, uncomprehending pity. "Anna," she said, her voice soft and chiding, "you are a sweet girl, but this is a world you do not understand. Men like your uncle thrive on pressure. It's what they do. It is not our place to interfere. It's unladylike. All this talk of storms and drought, it's all rather grim and unpleasant. You're making yourself anxious over nothing." She patted my hand, the same dismissive gesture my uncle had used. "Leave the business to the men, dear. It will all sort itself out." I was invisible, My concerns weren't just wrong, they were inappropriate, an unladylike transgression. Then, Mr. Julian Finch arrived. He was from Lloyd's of London, the venerable institution that underwrote the insurance for Hawthorne's entire fleet and its cargo. His arrival was unannounced and had the effect of a shark entering a paddling pool. He wasn't old, perhaps in his late 40s, with a lean, ascetic face and pale, watchful eyes that missed nothing. He wore a perfectly tailored but unassuming gray suit, and he moved through the panicked office with a preternatural calm that was more unnerving than any shouting would have been. He wasn't there to help. He was there to assess risk. He was the man who would decide if Hawthorne Maritime was still a viable business or if it was a liability so great that Lloyd's would have to cut its losses, a move that would trigger covenants with their banks and bring the entire company down. He set up shop in a small, glass-walled conference room. And for days, a parade of senior executives went in and out, their faces grim on the way in, ashen on the way out. Finch spoke little, but his questions were like surgical instruments, precisely targeted to find the weakest points. He didn't care about the Hawthorne legacy or their century of history. He cared about numbers, about exposure, about their plan to navigate the crisis, and it was becoming terrifyingly clear that they didn't have one. The breaking point came during an emergency briefing in the main conference room. The entire senior management team was there, along with Finch, who sat silently at the back of the room, observing. My uncle, looking utterly defeated, asked Beatrice to present their proposed mitigation strategy. Beatrice stood at the front of the room, looking pale but determined. She launched into a presentation filled with financial jargon and complex logistical charts. She proposed selling off several older vessels to free up capital, consolidating routes, and attempting to renegotiate key contracts by declaring force majeure. It was a plan born of desperation, a strategy of retreat and damage control. From my seat in the corner, where I had been tasked with taking the minutes, I felt a cold dread creep over me. Her plan was fatally flawed. Selling ships now, in a panicked market, would fetch pennies on the dollar. Declaring force majeure would destroy their reputation and invite a wave of lawsuits, and rerouting ships to what she thought were stable regions was a fool's errand, because she was sending them directly into the path of the next phase of the climate disruption. She was moving their chess pieces into a checkmate she couldn't even see. I had my own laptop with me. On my screen was a global map, alive with data streams, ocean currents, wind patterns, soil moisture indexes. I could see the drought in Australia intensifying, which would lead to a wheat harvest failure there in 3 months. I could see the conditions forming for a devastatingly dry season in the Amazon, which would cripple Brazil's soybean exports. Beatrice was proposing to send ships to Australia and Brazil. I don't know what came over me. It was a surge of something, desperation, anger, the sheer unbearable frustration of being the only person in the room who could see the cliff edge they were all sprinting towards. I raised my hand. Beatrice ignored me. I raised it higher. Beatrice, I said, my voice cutting through the tense silence, your projections for the Australian wheat market are wrong. Every head in the room swiveled towards me. My uncle looked horrified. Beatrice's face flushed with fury. What did you say? She hissed. The soil moisture deficit in Western Australia is at a 50-year high, I said, forcing myself to keep my voice steady, though my heart was hammering. Their harvest is going to fail. Sending vessels there is a waste of capital and time. The same is true for Brazilian soy. The real opportunity, the only one, will be in South African maize, and if we can position our bulk carriers in time, the secondary wheat harvest from Argentina. Beatrice stared at me, her mouth agape with disbelief. Are you insane? She finally sputtered. We're in a board meeting, discussing the fate of this company, and you're interrupting with your gardening tips. You're the girl who files papers in the basement. It's not gardening, it's climatology. I shot back, standing up now, my own anger surprising me. It's the science of predicting the very thing that is bankrupting us. You're looking at spreadsheets that reflect the past. I'm looking at the data that is creating the future. That is enough, my uncle roared, his face purple. Anna, sit down. You are embarrassing yourself and this family. The humiliation was absolute. The scorn in Beatrice's eyes, the pity in the faces of the other executives, the raw anger from my uncle. It was a physical blow. I sank back into my chair, my cheeks burning, my throat tight with unshed tears. I had spoken up, and I had been crushed. I had offered them a lifeboat, and they had laughed at me for not knowing how to swim. The meeting broke up in a state of disarray and fury. As I gathered my things, wanting nothing more than to disappear, a quiet voice spoke from behind me. That pressure anomaly you mapped over the Philippines. Where did you source that data? I turned. It was Mr. Finch. He was standing right there, his expression utterly unreadable. His pale eyes weren't looking at me with pity or scorn, but with a kind of detached, analytical curiosity. Startled, I stammered. It's a composite. I pull raw data from the NOAA satellites, cross-reference it with readings from Japanese and European meteorological buoys, and then weigh it against historical atmospheric river patterns. He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking from my face to the complex map still glowing on my laptop screen. He didn't praise me. He didn't offer a word of encouragement. He simply absorbed the information, his mind clearly working behind those still, gray eyes. I see, he said, and then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing alone in the wreckage of my public humiliation, clinging to the thinnest, most confusing sliver of hope I had felt since arriving in London. The days that followed were the quietest, most agonizing of my life. I was a pariah in the office and a ghost in the house. My uncle and Beatrice wouldn't even look at me, their anger a cold, heavy blanket that smothered all conversation. I was relieved of my minute-taking duties and sent back to the basement, a clear message that my brief, disastrous flight into the upper echelons of the company was over. I buried myself in my work, in the silent, orderly world of my data, because it was the only place where I felt sane. I tracked the worsening crisis, watching my predictions unfold on the world stage with a grim, hollow sense of vindication. It brought me no joy to be right. Every news report confirming another port closure or another failed harvest was another nail in the coffin of the company my family had built. The call for the final board meeting came on a Thursday. It had the feeling of a summons for a sentencing. Mr. Finch would be there to deliver his final assessment to the board of directors and the Hawthorne family. His recommendation would determine everything. The atmosphere in the office was funereal. People spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact. I wasn't invited, of course. I was just the archivist in the basement. But I knew I had to be there. This was the end of the story, one way or another, and I couldn't bear to hear the outcome secondhand. I slipped into the back of the grand boardroom, just as the meeting was starting, and took an empty chair against the wall, hoping to go unnoticed. The room was packed. The non-executive directors, grim-faced men and women who represented banks and investment funds, sat around the enormous mahogany table. My Uncle Thomas sat at the head, looking like a king who had already surrendered his kingdom. Beatrice was beside him, her face a pale, tight mask of defiance, and at the opposite end of the table sat Julian Finch, a folder in front of him, his posture radiating an unnerving calm in a room thick with desperation. The meeting began with my uncle giving a somber, broken summary of their situation. He acknowledged their staggering losses and their dire financial position. Then he handed the floor to Beatrice for one last, desperate presentation of their recovery plan. It was the same strategy she had presented before, only now it was dressed up in more elaborate charts and backed by even more frantic-sounding projections. She spoke quickly, her voice high and strained, trying to project a confidence that no one in the room actually felt. When she finished, a heavy silence descended. All eyes turned to Finch. He let the silence stretch, a form of psychological warfare that stripped away the last of Beatrice's composure. Then, he opened his folder. "Thank you, Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have reviewed your proposal, in detail." He paused again. "It's a comprehensive plan for bankruptcy." A collective gasp went through the room. Beatrice's face went white. Finch continued, his tone flat and analytical, as he began to systematically dismantle her entire strategy. He was merciless. "Your proposal to sell the VLCC's Hawthorne Pride and the Marion into the current market would net you, at best, 30 cents on the dollar, triggering a liquidity crisis. Your denation of force majeure on the Sumitomo grain contract would not, as you hope, absolve you of liability. It would, in fact, open you up to a damages claim that would exceed your entire cash reserve, as our legal team has confirmed your contract specifically excludes weather events of this predictable nature." He went on, point by point, his voice never rising as he surgically disassembled Beatrice's plan, laying the company's ruin bare for all to see. He wasn't just pointing out flaws, he was conducting an autopsy. When he was done, the room was utterly silent. My uncle had his head in his hands. Beatrice was staring at Finch, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. This was it, the end? Finch closed his folder. "Hawthorne Maritime," he said, his voice holding a note of finality, "has demonstrated a fundamental inability to comprehend the nature of the market in which it now operates. They are navigating a 21st century storm with a 19th century map. Therefore, my recommendation to the Board of Lloyds is to begin proceedings to revoke your insurance coverage, effective immediately." The words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Revoking their coverage was a death sentence. No bank would extend them credit. No client would sign a contract. They would be finished within a week. A low moan escaped my uncle. And in that moment, something inside me broke. It wasn't courage, not really. It was a colder, harder thing. It was the absolute certainty that I could not sit here in silence and watch my family's legacy, my father's legacy, be destroyed by sheer, stubborn blindness. "You're looking at the wrong map." My voice, clear and steady, cut through the shocked silence. Every single head turned towards me. The girl in the corner. I saw shock, annoyance, and then, on Finch's face, a flicker of something else. Interest. I stood up, my legs shaking, but my resolve solid. I walked from the back of the room to the head of the table. I could feel Beatrice's glare burning into me. I ignored her. I placed my laptop on the table, connected it to the projector, and with a click, Beatrice's failed strategy vanished from the screen, replaced by my living map of the world, a swirling, color-coded visualization of wind, water, and heat. "Mr. Finch is right," I said, my voice resonating with a confidence I didn't know I possessed. "You are using the wrong map. You are looking at a map of politics and economics. That map is obsolete. This is the map that matters now." I pointed to the screen. "This is not a series of random, unfortunate events. This is one event, a Grade 5 El Niño event, the strongest on record, acting as the engine for a global cascade of climatic disruption. And it is not unpredictable. It is a system, and like any system, it has rules, it has patterns." For the next 10 minutes, I talked. The words poured out of me, a torrent of data and analysis held back for months. I showed them how the warming in the Pacific was rerouting the jet stream, causing the drought in America. I showed them the atmospheric river, a literal highway of moisture in the sky that was being funneled into Southeast Asia, fueling the monsoons. I didn't just tell them what was happening, I told them what was going to happen next. "Your plan to send ships to Australia is a catastrophic mistake," I said, clicking to a new chart showing soil moisture telemetry. "The harvest there will fail." But Argentina, I clicked again, showing a different set of data. Their secondary wheat harvest, which is usually minor, is projected to have a bumper crop because of the same weather patterns. No one is looking there yet. Their prices are still at rock bottom. If you reposition your empty bulk carriers from the Indian Ocean now, you can be in Buenos Aires in 3 weeks, ready to buy up that entire harvest before the rest of the world even realizes the Australian crop is gone. You will not just be fulfilling your defaulted contracts, you'll be selling into a desperate market at a 500% markup. I laid it all out. A precise, daring, and utterly audacious strategy. Not of retreat, but of attack. It was a plan to use their fleet, not to run from the storm, but to ride the waves it created, to get ahead of the chaos and profit from it. When I finished, the boardroom was silent as a tomb. My uncle was staring at me as if he'd never seen me before. Beatrice was apoplectic, her face a mask of incandescent rage. It was Finch who broke the silence. He stood up and walked slowly to the front of the room, his eyes fixed on my screen. He didn't look at me. He looked at my data. "The South African maize projection," he said, his voice sharp. "You're predicting a surplus, based on increased rainfall, in the southern cone. The World Agricultural Outlook Board is projecting a deficit." "The board is using a 30-year climate average," I replied, without missing a beat. "Their model is biased by the drought years of the early 2000s. It doesn't account for the acute impact of this specific El Niño phase on the Benguela Current, which is pushing cooler, more stable air over the region. They're wrong." He pointed to another part of the map. "You're advocating moving container ships away from the Singapore-Rotterdam route, the most profitable route in the world." "It won't be for the next 6 months," I countered. "The intensified monsoon season will make the Malacca Strait a logistical nightmare. The real money will be on the secondary trans-Pacific routes, servicing the ports that will pick up the slack from the overwhelmed Chinese hubs, specifically Busan in South Korea and Prince Rupert in Canada." He grilled me for another 5 minutes, firing questions like bullets. He challenged my data sources, my methodology, my conclusions. With every question, I felt my confidence grow. This was my language. These were my maps. I was not a country mouse here. I was the only person in the room who knew the way home. Finally, he fell silent. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned to face the stunned board of directors. He walked back to his seat, picked up his folder, and deliberately tore his prepared recommendation statement in half. "Gentlemen," Julian Finch said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, "my previous assessment was incorrect. The company is not without a map." He paused and looked directly at me, for the first time, with something that resembled respect. "They just had the wrong map maker." He turned back to the board. "I am officially retracting my recommendation. Furthermore, I am submitting a new one. That Lloyd's of London underwrite this plan. Her plan, in its entirety. We will extend the necessary credit line to finance the repositioning of the fleet, effective immediately." He looked at my uncle. "On one condition. She runs it. Every part of it. The rest of you will do exactly as she says." The aftermath of that meeting was like the eerie calm in the eye of a hurricane. The world had been turned upside down. Power had shifted so abruptly that no one quite knew how to stand. A war room was established, not in the main boardroom, but in a smaller, more functional space. It was my war room. The big screen at the front was permanently linked to my laptop, displaying my living map. My charts and data sheets were pinned to every available wall space. I was given a team of the company's best logistics and trading officers, seasoned professionals who now looked to me, a 34-year-old archivist, for their orders. The first few days were tense. The team was skeptical, their professional pride wounded by being placed under the command of an outsider, a provincial. They followed my instructions with a grudging, formal obedience, their faces betraying their doubt. Beatrice was completely sidelined, a ghost haunting the edges of the operation. She would drift into the war room, watch for a few minutes with a look of thunderous resentment, and then leave without a word. My Uncle Thomas, to his credit, honored Finch's condition completely. He deferred to my every decision, his face a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning painful understanding of how profoundly he had misjudged me. He treated me with a new, hesitant respect that was almost more unnerving than his old condescension. My first major directive was the most daring. I ordered Captain Mallory, the veteran master of the Hawthorne Voyager, a massive bulk carrier sitting empty off the coast of Madagascar, to immediately change course. His destination was not Australia, as originally planned, but to sail south, around the Cape of Good Hope, and make for Buenos Aires with all possible speed. It was a journey of thousands of miles, burning millions of dollars in fuel, based on nothing more than my prediction. The resistance came almost immediately. Captain Mallory himself, a man with 40 years of sea under his belt, radioed in, his voice crackling with static and disbelief. "Control, this is Voyager. Confirming last directive. Did you say Buenos Aires? My orders are for Fremantle. There's no cargo contract for us in Argentina." I took the headset, myself, my team watching me. "Captain Mallory, this is Anna Hawthorne," I said. My voice calm and firm, I confirmed the directive. "Your destination is Buenos Aires. Your cargo contract will be waiting for you when you arrive. You are to proceed at maximum economical speed. How do you read?" There was a long pause. I could hear the hum of his ship's engines, the faint whisper of the wind over the South Atlantic. "Control," he said, his voice laced with professional skepticism. "My charts show clear sailing to Fremantle. The Southern Passage is unpredictable this time of year." "Captain," I replied, pulling up the satellite data for his specific coordinates, "in 48 hours, your current position will be hit by the leading edge of a developing cyclonic system, a system that doesn't appear on standard maritime charts yet. It's moving faster than the models predict. The Southern Passage will be clear. Trust me." Another pause, longer this time. I had challenged not just his orders, but his experience, his own reading of the sea. I held my breath. "Understood, Control," he finally said, the reluctance still there, but tinged now with a note of grudging compliance. "Voyager is altering course for Buenos Aires. Out." I put down the headset. The room was silent. I had staked the company's money and a captain's trust on a ghost storm only I could see. The next 2 days were agonizing. Then a report came through the International Maritime News Service. A freak cyclone had formed with unexpected rapidity in the Indian Ocean, battering the very sea lanes the Voyager would have been sailing. Several ships were caught in it. We had missed it by a day. In the war room, one of the senior traders let out a low whistle. The atmosphere began to change. Then, my predictions started coming true in a cascade. The Australian government officially declared a harvest failure, shocking the global markets. The price of wheat tripled overnight. A day later, our traders in Argentina, acting on my instructions, secured contracts for the entirety of the bumper crop, just as prices began to skyrocket. The Hawthorne Voyager, arriving perfectly on schedule, would be the first vessel to ship the most valuable commodity in the world. The deal single-handedly erased a third of the company's losses. One by one, the dominoes fell exactly as I had predicted. The port of Singapore became a quagmire of delays, just as our container ships were safely rerouted to the now booming port of Busan. The Brazilian soybean market collapsed. Our ships, already positioned off the coast of South Africa, were generating record profits shipping maize to energy companies in Asia, who were desperate for biofuel components. The vindication was overwhelming, a tide of success that washed away all doubt. The skepticism in the war room turned to respect, then to outright awe. They stopped calling me Miss Hawthorne. They started calling me Anna. One evening, as I was working late, tracking a new weather system forming in the Atlantic, Julian Finch appeared at the door of the war room. He was holding a bottle of what looked like very expensive single malt scotch and a thick, academic-looking book. He placed them on the central table. A good investment should yield a return, he said, his voice holding no inflection, but his eyes had a faint glint of something like approval. I looked at the book. The title was Advanced Principles of Satellite Meteorology. I thought you might find some of the orbital decay algorithms interesting, he added. It was, I realized, his version of a compliment, his way of acknowledging our shared language of systems and data. We stood there for a moment, not as insurer and client, but as two professionals who had found in each other a rare and unexpected peer. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the glowing maps of a world I had charted, I knew I had not just saved the company, I had saved myself. 6 months later, the view from my office was no longer a dusty basement wall, but a panoramic sweep of the River Thames. The title on my door read, Head of Agri-Maritime Analytics, a division I had built from the ground up. My war room had become a permanent department, a gleaming hub of technology, staffed by a hand-picked team of traders, logisticians, and meteorologists. We weren't just reacting to the market anymore, we were shaping it. Hawthorne Maritime wasn't just saved, it was more profitable and resilient than it had ever been in its 100-year history. My Provincial obsession was now the company's single greatest asset. My Uncle Thomas, now semi-retired, would visit occasionally, wandering through my department with a look of perpetual astonishment, as if he still couldn't quite believe this world had sprung from the mind of his quiet country niece. One afternoon, there was a soft knock on my office door. It was Beatrice. I hadn't spoken to her properly in months. She had been moved to a different department, a role in legacy client relations that was prestigious in name, but held no real power. She looked different, less sharp, the hard edges of her certainty sanded down. "Anna," she said, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair opposite my desk. She sat down, but didn't seem to know where to begin. She started, then trailed off. "What you did, what you're doing here, it's remarkable." She looked around my office, at the complex data streams on my monitors, the satellite images of global weather patterns. I never understood. "I know," I said, my voice neutral. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I don't mean I didn't understand the science. I mean I didn't understand you. I was awful to you. The things I said, the way I treated you, it was unforgivable." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine vulnerability in her. "I was arrogant, and I was jealous, I think. You had this quiet knowledge, this certainty, that I didn't. I mistook it for simplicity. I am so sorry." It was the apology I had once dreamed of hearing, the one I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times. But now that it was here, it felt distant. I knew it was born of her own humiliation, of her fall from grace, more than a true understanding of the hurt she had caused. It was the apology of the vanquished, not the enlightened. But I also knew that holding on to the anger would only anchor me to the past. "Thank you, Beatrice," I said calmly. "I appreciate you saying that. I accept your apology." "I accept it," I thought to myself, "but I don't forget. I know this apology is about you wanting to find your place in my new world, not about you truly regretting the old one." It was a distinction that mattered, a boundary I was drawing for myself. She might be sorry, but trust was a different country, one she would not be visiting again soon. She seemed relieved, the tension draining from her shoulders. We spoke for a few more minutes about superficial things, and then she left. I watched her go, not with triumph, but with a kind of weary peace. Her opinion of me no longer mattered. Her validation was a currency I no longer traded in. As I turned back to my work, the private line on my desk buzzed. It was a direct link to only a handful of people. I picked it up. "Anna Hawthorne." "Anna," a familiar dry voice said on the other end. It was Julian Finch. His tone was different now, when he spoke to me. Not warm exactly. That wasn't his nature, but it held the easy respect of a colleague. "I have a client, a major consortium, getting very nervous about their North Atlantic shipping lanes this winter. The standard forecasts are all over the place. They're worried about another series of rogue storms, like we saw last year. He paused. I told them I knew someone with a better map. So tell me, Anna, what do the winds tell you? I leaned back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. I looked out the window at the gray London sky, a sky I had learned to read, as well as the open skies of Norfolk. It was no longer a dead thing to me. It was alive with information, with stories, with power. The world had once told me my greatest passion was small and worthless. I had learned to stop listening to the world and instead to listen to the wind, the water, and the quiet, certain voice inside myself. So, that is my story. It's a story about how the very thing I was mocked for became my greatest strength. I learned that true value isn't determined by the approval of others, but by the quiet, steady cultivation of your own unique knowledge. What the world sees as a provincial obsession might just be a world-changing expertise waiting for its moment. I learned that family isn't always the people who share your blood, but the people who share your respect. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a skill or a passion that others dismissed, only to find it become incredibly important later on? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and I believe our stories are how we build a community that understands and supports each other. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and please subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today. Remember, being underestimated is not a weakness, it's a strategic advantage. I wish you all the strength to follow your own map, no matter what the rest of the world tells you.